Well, hello there, and welcome to this episode of the Terri Cole Show. I'm so happy that you are here. I get so many emails, you guys, from you on YouTube asking me questions about boundaries. My boyfriend said this. My girlfriend said this. Is this a boundary? They said it was just their boundary. So, this episode is all about 5 things that sound like boundaries, but are not boundaries, right? Because boundaries are not punishment to other people. They're not a lever, a way of controlling others, right? They're not what you do when someone makes you mad. And I feel like a lot of people think that's what they are. According to Terri Cole, and I wrote a whole book about it called Boundary Boss, right there. Your boundaries are made up of your preferences, your desires, your limits, and your deal breakers, and your ability to communicate them. That's it, right? That is literally the whole thing. So, part of what today's episode is about getting that definition in your hand and in your mind, right? So you can start to see that so much of what gets called setting a boundary out there in these internet streets for sure, and in real life, is something that is not setting a boundary. So the 5 most common, we'll call them boundary imposters, right? Because they're not boundaries, I can tell you that much. All right, let's get into what boundaries aren't, shall we? Okay, so starting with, when you think about how many people are teaching about boundaries now, which wasn't necessarily true a couple years ago, they can define them lots of different ways. What I'm teaching you today is the way that I define them and the words that I use and how I teach it to people so that you know how to do it, right? And why does it matter, right? Why does it matter for you to understand what real boundaries are? Because here's the thing, misusing words around boundaries, it just doesn't sound wrong. It actually makes doing it even harder, right? For example, when we call a threat a boundary, there's no relational benefit to that. And with real boundaries, there are relational benefits. So the cost of what happens when we're misusing the word boundaries and thinking that we're doing it right is that the relationship gets confused. We have the same conflicts, right? We fight about the same bullshit on loop, it seems, when we are misnaming these things. So what is not a boundary, number 1, is the ultimatum. So this is very common where people just say, if you do this, I'll leave, let's say. So why is it not a boundary? Well, it's aimed at controlling the other person, right? Not communicating your limit. So how you know it's not a boundary, because that only works if the other person complies. So let me give you a real life example. I had a client who married someone who was in recovery. They were married for a long time, and over the pandemic, he relapsed. And she was like, okay, definitely not what I signed on for, right? Because she was in recovery as well. And instead of saying, if you don't quit, I'll leave, she actually shared her deal breaker by saying, I will not stay in this marriage if you continue to be an active alcoholic. It's not me punishing you. You're basically saying, this is what I'm doing if you don't change your behavior. And for some people, it may sound like, oh, that's splitting hairs and that's nuance. But here's the thing. Sometimes in relationships, we do have deal breakers. If people perceive them as ultimatums, so be it. But from a therapeutic standpoint, they're really not. We need to know what we can and will tolerate. And she had clearly had this, they both had this conversation about staying clean and sober together. This was part of their vows. It was part of their relationship. So this was a big betrayal for her. But she did not say, you must quit or I'm out. She said, I will help you get back on the wagon to the best of my ability. But ultimately, if you don't regain your sobriety, I will have to end the marriage. And that is a boundary. And it's clear because she's just talking about herself, what she will do, right? And then that is why that type of a boundary can work, as opposed to just pointing out and giving an ultimatum. Not a boundary number 2 or imposter number 2 is the silent treatment. So what does it sound like? Well, it doesn't sound like anything. That's the point, right? Is that we are withdrawing in anger and using silence to say the words that we cannot say or that we don't know how to say. But why does it fail? The definition of a real boundary, right, when you think about what it is that withdrawal as punishment, right? Not communication of preference or limit. So they're two different things. So let's go back to what is the original definition of a boundary. It's knowing your preferences, desires, limits, and deal breakers, and having the ability to communicate them when you so choose. That's what it is. So when we pull the silent treatment, we are not communicating a preference or a limit. We are letting the silent sort of talk for us, quote unquote, but it doesn't, is the point. It is really damaging. The silent treatment and stonewalling, as we call it, is really damaging to relationships. And what it basically says is, if I don't like what you do, I will withdraw my love and attention from you. So what a real boundary would sound like instead of that, even if you're pissed and you feel like being withdrawn in anger, if you're used to giving the silent treatment, instead, you can just tell on yourself. This is what I have my clients do. You can say, I'm so mad right now. I feel like ignoring you and giving you the silent treatment. But I'm not going to, because I know that is not going to help us come back together, and that's what I want to do more than I want to punish you. But I need a little bit of time. Can we talk about this tonight after 7, right? We can set times to talk. We can do all the things. But if you don't say some of those things, your silence just creates more confusion. And it's mean. It's a really mean thing to do. Not to mention super immature. Okay. Not a boundary, number 3, or imposter number 3, the overexplanation. So what does that sound like? It's like your limit, right? When you're trying to set a limit with someone, but you feel compelled to have 14 dialogues and paragraphs of text justifying why you need that. This tells the other person and me that you don't believe you have a right to whatever that limit is that you want to set. So why does it fail, right? It fails the definition of a boundary because it invites negotiation, right? There's a sign and a signal that you don't fully believe that you have your right to your own preference, because if you did, you wouldn't feel compelled to convince the other person that that's okay, right? It's like, and even you can tell you're doing this is even if someone has agreed to the limit, and you might still be talking and justifying and saying, and I'm just so exhausted because of this and that. And I want to get clear that we're talking about the distinction between convincing someone that you have a right to set a limit and basically looking for their approval, right? Convincing and approval are different, and convincing and context, providing context, are very different. And I see these two things get mixed up all the time. Context means I may share more information with my close friend if I'm not going to do something, or I can't attend something that she would like me to go to. I wouldn't be like, no is a complete sentence with my friend, because there's no need. Why do I got to be so hostile? I can say, babe, I would love to do it. I can't, because the next morning I have an 8 a.m. presentation that I have to prep for. So I can't stay out late on Wednesday night. I'm so sorry, but I'll be there in spirit. I'm telling my friend, especially if it's a friend that I would normally go to her thing, and it's not a justification. It's a communication. And that is different. So I just want to make sure we get that distinction in there. And that's exactly what a real boundary would sound like, is you would tell her you can't make it, which is the boundary, and the context can be the why, which you are not required to provide for every person that you're setting a boundary with. If it's your close people and people you love and you want to be understood more accurately, then sure, that's when I provide more context. But again, there's a happy medium between 14 paragraphs to set a limit and no is a complete sentence. And I think that neither one of them is necessarily correct. And I think that there's nuance is very important when it comes to actually setting boundaries. Not a boundary, number 4, is the preemptive cancellation. So it's almost like bailing before you have to say no, like setting yourself up. The person's going to ask you to do whatever it is, and you being like, I'm doing something already. It's a way to avoid, though, having the conversation. Therapeutically, people do this in relationships as well, where it's like, I'm so afraid of being rejected that I will find a way to sabotage this relationship and end it myself. Like, I will reject you before you can reject me. And this is sort of the same thing, where you're bailing before you have to say no to someone. And some people can think it's strategic and it's smart, but avoidance, right, is not the same as being able to have a boundary conversation, right? Because you're not really communicating anything if you're preemptively avoiding the conversation. And how do you feel about it after? You might feel initial relief, and then you might feel bad later. So a real boundary would just have the conversation, be able to say no. The person asks you to do something that you don't want to do or you can't do. This is the thing with becoming a boundary boss, is that we have to truly believe in our heart of hearts that it's okay for us to say no to other people, that it's okay to not self-abandon, because we have to look at it this way. Every time you say yes when you want to say no, you are prioritizing someone else's feelings, wants, desires over your own. But what are you saying to yourself, and what are you doing to yourself? It's self-abandonment. It's saying to you how you feel, what you think, and what you want is less important than what other people expect and want from me. So this is a super valuable skill, you guys, to get in your lives, of just being able to say no, just being able to leave when you need to, just prioritizing how you feel. I was just at this beautiful event in Brooklyn. It was like a professional event with gathering with all these people, and there was a final night gathering and party, and I really wanted to do it. And I had been in the city since Tuesday, and I lived 3 hours north of the city, so I was living out of a suitcase, hotels, friends' houses, all the things. And I just know my limit. I was like, I have to change my ticket and go home. And I said to my friend, hey, I'm sorry I'm bailing early. I said to my friend who organized the thing, I've got to go home. Like, you just got to go. They went on. I feel like a lot of times when it comes to our boundaries, we feel like we have all of this pressure on us. Like, if I leave, it's going to ruin the final night party for everyone, And it's kind of funny. It's like we're overestimating our own importance. Certainly I was, when I was sort of grappling with it. And then I thought, nobody cares. They're doing their thing. I've spent plenty of time with these people. And the most important thing is I was exhausted and needed to go home. So I had to honor that. So I just want to bring it back to one truth while we're talking about what boundaries are and what they're not, is that to be fluent in the language of boundaries, you have to believe that what you think, how you feel, and what you want is important. And then we have to take that one step further. What you think, how you feel, and what you want has to be the most important to you. And I would say, as women, we were taught to not think that that would be cool. But I'm telling you it is, because it doesn't mean we can't and won't compromise. Of course we will, and we do. But to you, your own approval of what you're doing, how you're living your life, has to be more important than pleasing other people. We just have to get away from this. It's like we're allergic to other people's disapproval. And we have to just toughen up. It is okay. People cannot like what you're doing, be disappointed by your decision, and you can still have a relationship with them. You can still stay lovingly connected to them, even if they don't love everything that you're doing. So I think we really have to just dial into, how do I feel? What do I want? Because that's the only way you know your preferences, desires, limits, and deal breakers, is if you take the time to care about how you feel. All right, we are getting down to our number 5. So this is not boundary. Number 5 is when we say to someone, I just need space, right? Where we use a physical, like a vague, indefinite, we don't necessarily have a return plan to them. Because some people will say, well, I'm drawing a boundary. I said I needed space. Okay. It fails the definition of being a boundary, though, because it's not a stated preference, like we have to be clear or limit. It's too broad. It's rejecting of the other person in its own way, but there's no way to have it be healthy because you're not telling the truth about what you need. So the difference, right, between a stated limit with a timeline and like this open-ended retreat is what it's like when you're like, I need space. So what would it sound like if you were doing it in a healthy way? How could we make this non-boundary turn into a boundary? Well, you could say, I need more time at my own apartment during the week. So instead of coming over Monday through Thursday, I'm going to make it Tuesday through Thursday. How do you feel about that? They may say, I don't like it. I want to be with you all the time. And then you have a boundary conversation, and then you have a real negotiation, and then people talk about their needs. Each person talks about their needs, and you come to a resolution. And maybe you can't budge. Maybe you really need Mondays, and that's okay. And if it's not okay with that person, then whatever will happen with the relationship because of it will happen. But the difference between just sort of lobbing a Molotov emotional cocktail of, I need space, that is not a healthy or appropriate boundary if it is not followed up with what that means to you. Because the other person has a right to know what that means to you. Real boundaries, what do they look and sound like? They look and sound like you knowing your preferences, desires, limits, and deal breakers, and having the ability to communicate them when you so choose. So I don't want you to minimize your preferences. They matter too, because your preferences are not just some of the things that make up your boundaries. Your preferences, desires, limits, and deal breakers are the things that make up who you are in this life. So it's really important that you know them. And then herein lies the rub. You can't just know it. You have to know it and then be fluent enough in the language of boundaries, which, listen, you guys, I'll put some stuff in the guide. Also, hello, if you have not read Boundary Boss, I wrote an entire book on this with a million scripts in the book. terricole.com/guide for the guide. And I'll also make sure there's a link for you to go buy the book or get the audio book. People love the audio of Boundary Boss. If you haven't done it, do it. It is a gift you can give yourself becoming fluent. And I think so much of what is really happening with these imposters, if we were to look at the non-boundary boundaries we talked about today, or the imposter boundaries, most of the imposters are about control. Some part of what is going on with these is about controlling the other person and, a lot of times, avoiding ourselves. Because a real boundary for you doesn't necessarily require their compliance. It would be nice if they complied, right? But if they don't, you're still going to do what it is that you need to do. And so whenever you're talking about them and pointing out is when you know you might be stumbling into imposter boundary territory, and it might not be the real deal. I hope so much that this episode of the Terri Cole Show added clarity to your understanding of what are boundaries and what aren't boundaries, because I feel like there is a lot of misinformation out there on these internet streets, and I'm hoping to clear up some of the myths and information. Please don't forget to go get the guide that I made for you, terricole.com/guide. I hope you have the most amazing week. And as always, take care of you.